So today you should have gotten a worksheet that looks like this. Says Renaissance music at the top of it, has some information on it for you, and then also you have a worksheet that you can use to kind of follow along with it, as well as a crossword to help you study vocab on the back of it. This is just a very broad overview of the Renaissance period. We will be digging into much more specific material as the days go on, but I thought that before we go for a long break, I was not going to overwhelm you with tiny little details about stuff. So let's read this sheet together, shall we? The Renaissance period is the time period between 1450 and 1600, and you note that that time frame is a whole lot shorter. Think back to the medieval time period, which ranged from 450 to 1450, and now we're looking at a much shorter span of time, but an extremely, extremely important span of time, which we'll talk about in a moment here. The Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth. Before the Renaissance, Europe was in a dark time called the Middle Ages. During this time, the country was devastated by a plague called the Black Death, which killed half the country. And I would, just as an aside, another word for the Black Death is the bubonic plague. I actually did a research paper on that one time. I don't know how I ended up with that topic, but it was really, really bad. And in a lot of ways, it kind of reminds me of like the current pandemic that we're in right now, except it was way more gross. You would get these like boils that would like bubble up under your skin, and they would bleed, and you would like bleed to death, and you would like ooze, and it was disgusting. And the problem was they didn't understand enough about germs and germ theory to understand that like even like handling dead bodies or having ceremonies around dead bodies was spreading it. So all these people were dying, and then as people went to bury the dead, they were catching it and dying it too. Bad, bad news. I think they started to catch on to the whole like germs kill you thing toward the end of it. And then this is really sad, but they just started chucking dead bodies in like mass graves because they realized that if they didn't get rid of the body, which had the germs in it still, that they were at risk because they were seeing what was happening. If you have ever heard the children's rhyme, ring around the rosies, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. I mean, you probably have heard that, and everybody falls on the floor and laughs, and it's a great time. This is actually from the Middle Ages, and here's what it's about. Ring around the rosies. That was actually, they were talking about the circular rings under those boils that would bubble up under your skin. And then they would say a pocket full of posies. It sounds so sweet, like a little flower girl or something. No, what it was you were literally like rotting as you were dying. So in order to cover up the stench, you would carry like dried, crushed up flowers on your person and in your pockets and in your clothes to cover up for the fact that you were literally rotting as you were dying. And then they would say, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Okay. So they got to the point where they realized that they needed to burn these bodies so that they didn't spread the contagion any further. So that is what this is about. Isn't that dark? I don't know why I know all this stuff. Whatever. I'm full of weird, interesting knowledge. I think it's interesting. Anyway, the economy was in poor shape, and only the very rich and very poor existed, so no middle class. But around 1450, the economy started to improve, and a middle class emerged, which started a rebirth in Europe of all of their culture. They became interested in new things like art and music and literature and education. All great things. Sorry. I have a funny camera angle here. Instrumental music grew in popularity with the development of new instruments. The madrigal, however, was the most popular form of music. We're going to talk a lot about madrigals coming up. A madrigal is a song usually sung by 5 or 6 voices, and its text is usually a poem. And madrigal composers use a technique called word painting or text painting. And what they do is like, for instance, if your poem was about the waves of the ocean and you were singing the word ocean instead of just singing ocean. You might sing something like this, or the composer might write, ocean, so that it was like the waves of the ocean. They loved doing that little thing and just seeing if their audiences could pick up on what they were trying to communicate with the music along with the text. A popular madrigal composer was Thomas Weelkes. He wrote over 500 madrigals. And a short aside about Thomas Weelkes, he's an interesting guy. He worked for the church, which as musicians, most people either had to work for the church or they had to work for like a king, or else they couldn't find work. Because remember, the middle class was brand new. So it was either you worked for the really rich people who could pay you, or you didn't work at all. Because remember, there was only really rich and really poor. So Thomas Weelkes worked for the church, but he got in trouble all the time because he was constantly drunk. But he was also really good at writing music. So he would get written up, and they've actually found these basically Thomas Weelkes detention slips where they're basically oh, yep, he was out running around drunk again. But then the next day he'd come in and write gorgeous music and all was forgiven. The other thing that he routinely did was he swore in church. He said vulgar, profane things, and that was written about too. But again, he was so talented, and evidently he was kind of a funny guy. And he got away with it. So that's Thomas Weelkes for you. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more now about the development in art and literature during the Renaissance period.